exactly 4 years since the Arab Spring forever changed Egypt. The world watched it all unfold on television as for more than 2 weeks, massive crowds gathered in Cairo's Tahrir Square, calling for President Hosni Mubarak to step down. On February 11, 2011, they got their wish. Mubarak handed over power to the military, and the changes began. But since then, Egypt seems to have gone from one tyranny to another. Clashes have persisted, protesters have been arrested, and in just the past 24 hours, nearly 200 people were sentenced to death, accused of playing a role in the deadly violence in 2013, following the ouster of Islamist President Mohamed Morsi. So how do we get to where we are today, and is there an end in sight? That's the subject of the new book, Once Upon a Revolution, which examines the events of 2011 through the stories of two very different types of revolutionaries. The author of that book joins me now. Thanasi Cambanis is a fellow at the Century Foundation. Thanasi, thanks for being here.
Great to be with you, Adam.
So your book focuses on two protagonists to tell the broader story of the revolution in Egypt. Who are they, and why did you pick them?
So I went to Tahrir Square at the beginning of the revolution, and I actually picked about a dozen people to follow. And I focused on folks who were actually obsessed with politics and who wanted to transform the revolutionary moment into some kind of lasting institutional political change. By the end of the 4 years, when the struggle seemed to have been lost for now, I picked the two characters who were the most emblematic and who had, I think, the biggest arc of change. One was a Muslim brother who came out of a very religious tradition, but actually unexpectedly embraced the idea of a secular state and abandoned the strict dictates of the Brotherhood and was eventually expelled.
And this is Moaz Abdul Karim, right?
Exactly, yes, Moaz Abdul Karim, and a young pharmacist. The other character was someone who was very apolitical, a 40-year-old bourgeois architect. He was someone who avoided politics until the year before the revolution, and he was pushed so much to the breaking point by the failures of the state and by the daily humiliations that he finally, in a sort of act of desperation, became an underground revolutionary leader in the year before Tahrir.
Let me ask you a little more about their motivations. For Bassem, what was it that pushed him out of this sort of life of, quiet acceptance of all the things he had to suffer into revolution or rebellion? What was it that pushed him over the edge?
What he saw was that after 3 generations of struggle, the quality of life of his family was slipping inexorably back into poverty, no matter how hard he worked. And he was a huge workaholic, 18-hour days at the family business that he established. At the same time, following the rules, keeping his mouth shut, he found that he was subject to the same kind of abuses by the police. And there was an emblematic event when one of his nieces was sexually assaulted, and they went to the police, and the officer put his feet up on the table very rudely and said to them, "If you catch the culprit, we'll lock him up, but it's not our job." He realized that the state didn't care at all about his people, and if he followed the rules, things were just going to get worse.
All right, and one more motive question for Moaz. What was it that made someone who was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood suddenly decide, okay, a secular state could be the way to go? That seems like even a bigger shift than the one you described Bassem going through.
He essentially was a deeply religious man who learned discipline from the Muslim Brotherhood, but took his idea of faith and his idea of the ideals of Islam and concluded from them that a religious group like his should stay as far away from politics as possible. It's actually quite similar to the Catholic anti-war movement in the States in the 70s, where you take these sort of almost fundamentalist religious texts and use them to arrive at a very pluralistic and humble understanding of a political activist role.
So you talk about, I can't remember the exact turn of phrase you used, but about the revolution stalling at least for now, or failing at least for now. I can't remember how you put it. What is the status of the revolution, and what, if anything, do you think it achieved that's lasting?
Well, so today the military regime in charge of Egypt is more repressive and seemingly stronger than anything we've seen in 60 years. There are almost 50,000 people in prison just for the crime of political protest today. So it looks like it's back on its heels and the old regime has won for now. But I'm confident that what we are seeing today is the first turn in a generational process of political change. So the caveat is that an incredibly ruthless regime can shut anything down, right? We've seen this in China. We've seen this all over the world. So if this regime is willing to just lock up and shoot and kill everybody ad infinitum, then yes, there won't be political change. The process that can't be stopped, however, is the individual and group evolution of identity agency, and citizenship. These people, and there were millions of them over the last 4 years, who went out and risked their lives. They got shot at, they got beaten, they got tortured to do something that for 60 years they had been taught and trained was never to do and had been told was impossible to happen. They all did that, and those individuals cannot change. Their concept, their sense of entitlement, the fact that all of them at some point in the last 4 years toppled a regime through mass protests, they will never again quietly accept this kind of twin failure. Humiliation plus failure to deliver any of the basic goods of government.
What mistakes did the revolutionaries make?
Well, so first of all, the revolution was crushed and defeated more than it failed, right? The old deep state came back played a long game, worked with a lot of resources and vengeance, so they actually won the fight. It wasn't so much that the revolutionaries lost. However, they made some really key mistakes that they have to resolve if things are ever going to turn out differently. And the two I would focus on are the split between secular and Islamist revolutionaries, and the second is the allergy to politics, the refusal to engage in the dirty long-term work of saying what comes next after we kill the king and topple the regime.
So why is there this long-standing tradition in Egypt of politics being sort of a dirty word and something people don't want to admit they practice?
Cleverly, authoritarian regimes going back at least 60 years to the 50s have spread this idea that true patriotism is what the army practices, nationalism, selfless nationalism, which means surrendering all power to the generals, and anyone who participates in politics or tries to form a party is, in the vernacular, is looking for a chair. They're trying to get a selfish share of power. And bizarrely, you could see young revolutionaries, even in the heat of a moment where they were under attack, maligning each other as selfish grandstanders when the order of the day was actually to come up with a political plan.
You have been pretty harsh on the United States in its response to what happened in Egypt and its sort of strategy, broader Middle Eastern strategy. How did the U.S., as you put it, manage to alienate both the revolutionaries and the current government of Egypt?
Well, I would preface this by saying that if the U.S. got it all right, things would have still gone wrong. We're not in the driver's seat here, but it's still important to get it right. What the U.S. has managed to do through every stage of Egypt's revolution and the sort of retrenchment and the reception of the old regime is it has been behind events, and it's always first embraced the people who are falling, and then as they're falling has jumped to the other side. So somehow the U.S. has managed to enrage and alienate the generals that it has never stopped funding, the revolutionaries who it rhetorically embraced, and even the Muslim Brothers whose regime it acted almost as a PR agent for a brief year.
All right, given that, if you were offering free advice to President Obama or whoever succeeds him, briefly, what should we be doing in Egypt?
Well, I would say we should put our money where our mouth is and recognize that Egyptian stability is in our interest, and stability in the long term is not what we get through a devil's bargain with a repressive totalitarian regime, but rather what we would get from a government that would go through somewhat of a turbulent process for 5 or 10 years, but which at the end would actually be accountable to its own citizens, capable of feeding them, capable of giving them a little bit of a political outlet. That's the kind of ally that one can get long-term support from, instead of 1 or 2 or 3 year increments of tight cooperation, but constantly living in the specter of collapse.
All right, Thanasi Cambanis, thank you.
Great to be with you.